today. If you're looking to switch things up with an easy but still fun and creative alternative to free motion or straight line walking foot quilting, consider using the decorative stitches that might already be built into your sewing machine. We'll be focusing on the wave or serpentine stitch today, but don't worry if your selection of built-in stitches is different. You can still try these techniques with some of the stitches that you do have. Here's an overview of our approach today. Part 1, play with the stitch settings. By that, I mean length and width. Part 2, play with the stitching paths. We'll cover channel quilting, quilting anchored by patchwork, and quilting lines independent of patchwork. And I'll include a stitching order demo too. Part 3, play with spacing, or how far apart the lines of stitching are. Part 4, play with thread. It can blend or contrast so that it becomes another design element. And finally, Part 5, some quick troubleshooting tips, from presser feet recommendations to what you can do if your thread breaks or bobbin runs out in the middle of a line of stitching. This is one of my favorite decorative stitches for quilting on a domestic sewing machine. It's particularly easy to use as it is a nice open stitch that moves primarily in one direction. While not found on every machine, it is widely available, though your machine might call it something different or simply assign it a stitch number. Let's start by checking out what happens when we play with the stitch settings, adjusting the length and/or width of the stitch. As with any decorative stitch, playing with the stitch length and width can produce very different effects. In the interest of keeping things moving today, let's focus on stitch length in this video. Here we are at a stitch length of 1. You can see how pronounced those curves are. And here's a stitch length of 2. Look at how much the stitch has already changed. The curves have really softened. And finally, 3. The curves have become more like a gentle wave. This is as far as I would go with this particular stitch on this particular machine. Here's a peek at my practice fabric where I labeled each line of stitching as I changed the stitch length. In each case, the first number is the stitch width, and the second number is the stitch length that I used. Here's an even closer view. The sample stitching shows a shift from a stitch length of 1 for the bottom row to a stitch length of 3 for the top row. Notice how dramatically the curves changed. As you can see, longer stitches produce more gentle curves, while shorter stitches produce tighter curves. Now let's look at what happens when you stitch a grid. What a difference! It hardly even looks like the same stitch. The longer stitches also make a huge difference in stitching time. The more gentle curves will be a lot faster to stitch out. Here's our first quick tip. Making the stitch length a little longer can help if you're having trouble moving the quilt sandwich smoothly through your machine. It can also speed up the quilting process considerably. But if the stitch gets too long, the stitching may start to look choppy, and the design might begin to lose some of its gracefulness. It's not about right-wrong, though. It's more about personal preferences. Here's another way we can add joyful variety to our quilts, playing with different types of stitching paths across the quilt. Let's start with channel quilting, which just means parallel lines in one direction. This is the most common approach because it's quick, easy, and looks great on all kinds of different quilts. For this quilt, I used the same stitch settings throughout. But here's another approach. By stitching my rows closer together and alternating rows stitched at different widths or lengths, I created small changes in the appearance of the stitching. Same stitch, slightly different energy. And while we're on the subject of channel quilting, that is, parallel lines of quilting across the quilt, I want to give you some quick tips for stitching order and keeping everything even without a lot of marking. If you're already comfortable with channel quilting, feel free to skip ahead using the chapter markers. There's 5 blocks across. This is the Hold Tight pattern by Sharon Holland. And I marked the midpoint with white chalk, just a straight line across each line of blocks. And that's the only marking I did, just the midpoints. And then to start quilting, I started in the middle, did the next seam, middle, next seam, middle. Then I rotated it and did the same thing where starting from the middle, seam, middle, working in that direction. And that acted as stabilizing lines. And that's important on something like this when you're channel quilting or quilting in parallel lines, whether they're curvy or straight. Because if you don't do that, what most quilters, and you might not, but what most quilters find if they don't do it like that, is that they end up with, instead of having all the lines evenly lined up at the top of the quilt, they find they start to have the whole thing drift down or drift up. And all of a sudden, the edges of the quilt are not even. One is higher than the other, or one side is lower. The other thing that can happen is that as you're stitching, you might start an inch away from the seam, and then by the time you get down at the bottom, you're an inch and a half away from the seam. Your lines aren't straight anymore. Very common. So by giving yourself those guidelines, in my case, it was in the middle of the block and on the seam, that divided the spaces up so that then the next round I did between those two lines, and I could just eyeball that between those two lines, all the way across, and then between those lines, and you get the idea. And by working it in gradually that way, I was able to keep everything nice and even, everything is parallel, and we don't have any weird spacing issues, and everything stayed even at the top and the bottom of the quilt. So I hope that tip helped. Okay, so that sample transitions nicely into our next section, grids following or anchored by the patchwork. This is one of my favorite ways to use this stitch. Using the structure of the patchwork as an anchor, I can build grids of wave stitching that fall partly over seams and partly across the fabric. I find this a lovely way to add softness and texture to a strong geometric quilt pattern. And just to clarify, I'm not stopping and starting here. I'm stitching right across the blocks as they alternate in direction, so all the lines are continuous. First like this, and then like this. Easy peasy. And here we are. I really love this effect. Here's a close-up of a different quilt. I started the quilting process for this quilt by using my wave or serpentine stitch right on top of the seams between the blocks. And then I stitched down the middle of the white kite shapes. Here's another close-up, and this required no marking at all. And here's the full baby quilt after washing. You can see the soft crinkling that is accentuated by the wavy quilting lines. Which brings us to another quick tip. Stitching order matters. To stabilize the quilt and minimize distortion, I recommend stitching the on-grain lines before stitching on the bias, and that includes curves too. But there are always exceptions, which brings us to our next section. All over grids, independent of the patchwork. All of the wavy serpentine stitching on this quilt is on the bias. Here's an even closer look. You can see that I stitched corner to corner across the blocks instead of on the seams. And again, no marking needed. There are no set rules, just guidelines and suggestions. Here's a quilt I quilted with an all-over diagonal grid. Since I didn't have seams to follow, I used low-tack painter's tape to help keep the spacing even. I moved the tape after every couple of rows and kept reusing it across the quilt. It kept its stickiness a surprisingly long time. It's easier to see the quilting on the back side of this quilt. You can tell that I used a relatively longer stitch length. Let's move on now to spacing, or how far apart you want your quilting lines to be. Again, there are no set rules, but you will want to consider the batting you are using and any guidance the manufacturer lists on the packaging. And I also like to consider the overall scale of the quilt. For example, the quilting lines on this table runner are roughly an inch apart. while the lines in the grid on this quilt are about 1.5 inches apart. And the grid lines on this quilt are 5 inches apart, following the size of the blocks. I took a different approach on this bed quilt and changed up the spacing to create a subtle rhythm across the surface of the quilt. It's a little hard to see in this photo, but here's the full quilt. Which brings us to our next section, playing with thread. A blending thread tends to emphasize subtle texture without competing with the design of the quilt or the fabrics, while a contrasting thread can be a little more noticeable, especially up close. This sample happens to be variegated, so the thread colors change across the stitching lines. You can see that I used a blending neutral thread here so that I would have nice texture without competing with the wonderful tulip pink animal prints. In fact, I had to turn off the lights in order to create enough shadows to allow the stitching to show up clearly in this photo. Here's a quick look at the finished quilt. The quilting is almost invisible until you get up close. And in this quilt, the creamy white thread just about disappears into the print fabrics. But check this out. Since I used solid colors here, not prints, I had a lot of fun with the thread. You don't notice the color changes in the thread when you look at the quilt from across the room, but it's a fun detail when you get closer. Okay, since things don't always go to plan in the real world, let's talk a little bit about troubleshooting. Let's start with using a walking foot. Just like we discussed in the decorative stitch binding video, which I'll link below, if you're getting ripples, tucks, or stretched out edges, it's typically because the layers of your quilt aren't feeding through your machine all at the same time. So a walking foot or an even feet foot can be a huge help. And don't worry if yours looks a little bit different than mine. The styles do vary. But be aware that walking feet may not be comfortable with significant reverse or side-to-side motion. Some can handle a little bit of it, but others may be engineered to only move forward. It's not an issue with the wave or serpentine stitch I'm using today, but many other decorative stitches involve a backward component as part of their pattern, so be aware of that potential issue. If you have a dual feed foot like this, you may have more leeway in your stitch choices, but even these awesome systems may not work perfectly well with every single decorative stitch option. Mine happens to be a brother machine, but one of my viewers shared that the dual feed foot for her Pfaff machine handles decorative stitches really well too. Please feel free to share in the comments what kind of machine you're using and if you have a walking foot that you can use with decorative stitches. One more caution, check your stitch width. Use the hand wheel to manually cycle through the stitch for a complete revolution to make sure that your needle won't accidentally hit the presser foot and break. As I've mentioned before, I've had that happen, and it's scary. Okay, one more thing. What do you do if your thread breaks or you run out of bobbin thread in the middle of a line of stitching? Most people immediately assume that they're going to have to remove that entire line of stitches, but that may not be the case. Let's look at this example. You can see that I left a loose thread end hanging off the top here because I wanted it to be easier for you to see where I restarted my stitching in the photo. Let me explain. If you look really closely, you can see that there's a slight pattern interrupt in the stitching, but it's not really noticeable in the finished quilt. I strongly recommend testing this method before using it, as it works better with some stitches than with others. Start by trimming any loose threads on the front and back of the quilt. Temporarily switch to a straight stitch and a very short stitch length. Beginning with a locking stitch, if you have one, you can still make this work if you don't. Bring the bobbin thread up through all the layers of the quilt and hang on to both threads until you've taken the first few stitches. This will prevent a bird's nest on the back of the quilt. Now, stitch right on top of the first 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch of stitching, following the curve or pattern. This is meant to lock both the old stitching and the new. Here's the overlapped area again in my sample. This is where the thread broke, and here's where I restarted with my locking stitch and very short straight stitches. When you get to the end of the overlap, switch back to the decorative stitch and proceed. Trim the thread ends or knot and bury them if you didn't start with a locking stitch. And again, here's what it looks like before trimming or burying the loose thread end. This method may not work with all decorative stitches, but when it does work, it sure can save you a lot of extra time with your seam ripper. Whatever built-in decorative stitches you have to play with, I hope you'll have fun experimenting with them and figuring out the options that you like best. If you enjoy these videos, please consider joining my email list so we can stay in touch. I'll include that link below too. And those of you in my Quilting Friends channel membership, there's a new resource that goes with this video waiting for you. Happy quilting, everyone.